Hey there, Beau Liddell with Images by Bolin. Welcome to one of my star photography tutorials. As you may know, in addition to geometric distortion and light falloff, otherwise known as vignetting, that are illustrated in this slide, essentially all conventional camera lenses suffer from some aberrations regardless of the quality of their glass. These aberrations occur because lens elements are designed with curved surfaces that bend and focus light differently depending on where the light falls on the element. Fortunately, geometric distortion and light falloff are easily fixed when applying lens correction profiles during post-processing. Unfortunately, lens aberrations cannot be so corrected with lens profiles. By far the most notorious aberrations we want to avoid when taking star photos are chromatic aberrations, such as those shown here where points of light look like comets or star trails. Directional spherical aberrations, such as those shown here around the brightest stars, which can also look like comets, and particularly astematic abnormalities such as the severe sagittal astigmatism shown here, which can make stars look stretched out, squashed, or even like diamonds, birds, or flying saucers. As you can also see in this example, these types of aberrations may also be accompanied by chromatic aberrations, otherwise known as color fringing. Since there's no such thing as a perfect lens, we must either live with the anomalies or go to extra lengths to mitigate them up front using appropriate aperture settings during capture, or after the fact by trying to fix them using image editing tools. Lens aberrations affect the detail and contrast in an image most along the edges and corners of the frame, as shown in the upper right corner of this magnified view of a star photo, and in general are much worse when using wide-angle lenses. They're also worse when shooting a lens wide open, and the faster a lens is, meaning the wider the maximum aperture, the worse the aberrations will be when shooting wide open. Many of these aberrations can be mitigated significantly by stopping the lens down to a smaller aperture. But since there's very little light at night, and since the sky and the Milky Way is so immense, we usually have to use short focal lengths and shoot with a fast aperture of f2.8 or larger. To complicate matters, the aberrations we want to avoid are even more apparent on bright points of light, and as a result, and already shown, the stars along edges and corners of a night sky photo will appear as anything but the sharp, round objects we expect and want to portray in our imagery. In addition, if shooting a lens at f2 or wider, spherical aberration, which produces a soft glowing effect around specular highlights, often occurs around stars throughout the frame as opposed to just the corners and edges for other aberrations as shown in this photo. In recent years, however, the advancements of digital technology and imaging software have provided star photographers a means of minimizing, if not eliminating, these aberrations during post-production, and thereby increasing the quality of the final output, especially if it's going to be reproduced in a large format. In this first of a three-part tutorial, I'll introduce a very simple way you can remove most aberrations from a star photo by taking an immediate second refocused photo that'll be blended with the first. If you've purchased fast lenses with apertures wider than f2.8 for star photography, then using this technique, as well as those shown in future parts, will enable you to take full advantage of the additional light gathering capability of these lenses while avoiding the aberrations they all too often exhibit. So let's get started. All right, so here's a couple images in the grid view of my Lightroom catalog. They're rather uncompelling compositions to be true. I was testing a new lens about a month ago. Was nearly a full moon. I normally would be taking photos under darker conditions of the Milky Way, as well as including much more foreground. After all, we are taking landscape photos. But here I've just applied some basic Lightroom adjustments, exposure adjustments, lens profiles, and white balance. Um, but this does will serve our purpose to illustrate where aberrations occur and how we can go about taking multiple shots to remove them. And it simulates what we see before we start taking the photos we want by finding the darkest part of the sky with the brightest stars and focusing on infinity before we start shooting away. So wide angle lenses all suffer from field curvature. They focus light at the center differently than the corner and the edges, and they generate defocus blur, which in turn causes or augments the lens aberrations that you see in the corners and the edges. Now, when testing this lens, I discovered as I have with all other wide-angle lenses I've ever used, that the corner focus is slightly closer than infinity. So when I focus on the stars in the center of the image, I'm generating blur. I'm blurring the detail on the corners. Now this particular image taken at f1.4 at 8 seconds, 28 millimeter lens. And if I zoom to one-to-one view, you can see that the stars are very sharp and they're round. The only exception to that are the brightest stars here in the Orion constellation that are generating a little bit of spherical aberration. Now, when shooting at f1.4 and in some lenses down to f2.0, you simply can't avoid some of these spherical aberrations. This particular lens generates probably the lowest amount of aberration I've ever experienced, and for many photographers, this result would be more than acceptable without having to correct for. Although I will demonstrate how you can correct for this if you so choose in the next part 2 of this video series. At any rate, I have an image where the center portion of the frame, 75–85% of it, is in focus. But yet, if I zoom into the corner, you can see that there are some aberrations here in the very extreme corner, particularly on the brightest stars, where the stars look like birds or diamonds. This again is not very much aberration. Many would consider it acceptable and not worry about it. But knowing that there is field curvature with these lenses, and by defocusing slightly in front of infinity by maybe only a millimeter, maybe a fraction of a degree rotation of your focus ring, you can correct for these. So prior to that shot, I took this photo. If I toggle back and forth between them, you can see that the brightest stars do appear to glow more in the corner focused photo. And that's because I have now, in the process of focusing on the corners, defocused the center portion of the image here. So if I zoom in to the center, you can see that not only do I have the spherical aberration in the brightest stars within Orion, but I've also created them in a lot of other locations in the image. Now if I just toggle back and forth between the two photos, you can see that here there's less aberration in the center focused photo compared to that was corner focused. So at least at this point, you now know what causes the aberrations and how we can go about fixing them if we take multiple shots. Now this technique works well for single frame compositions. So whether a photo like this of constellations or more of a landscape photo, and it will work well if you're also taking 5 or 10 more photos to be used to reduce the noise by stacking the images in Photoshop. But if you're going to use this technique for stitch panoramas, it's not going to work so well. It takes too much time. Furthermore, if you know how to execute panorama techniques during capture, you can actually eliminate these aberrations if you're allowing for proper overlap and overshoot. I'll cover that in part 3 of this series. So at this point, we are now ready to port these photos into Photoshop. So I'm going to open them as layers in a single document, and you can do this a number of ways, either from Lightroom, Adobe Camera Raw, Adobe Bridge. You can even open them directly from within Photoshop under the File menu. At any rate, once loaded within Photoshop, I know that my top image here happens to be the corner focus shot because as I toggle it on and off, I can see the spherical aberration on the brightest stars appear. I'm just going to name that corner focus or something similar. Don't have to name the bottom layer, but I could do that if I wanted. You want to make sure that the corner focused shot is on top. Now I'm going to highlight both layers and select auto align layers from the edit menu. I like to do this because if it works, it's much faster. Although since we're only going to be aligning 2 images, it won't take that much time if we have to manually align them. But you can see that other than this portion of the region of the image, it didn't do a very good job aligning. And I find that this isn't all that uncommon. So I'm going to select undo and perform a manual alignment. The first thing I'm going to do to perform that alignment is highlight the corner focused photo and change the blend mode for that top layer from normal to difference. And as the name implies, it's going to highlight with light color the differences between the two images. And this works exceptionally well for star photos. Then I'm going to use Command T or Control T on a PC to enter in the free transform tool. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in to 100%. And I'm going to use my pen and Wacom tablet or mouse if you have that. And just do my best to try and align as many of the stars as possible. And when I do that, as the stars line up, the differences are going to disappear. Once I have the center aligned as best I can, and important to note that it's not crucial that you get all the stars perfectly aligned. It doesn't have to be that precise, and we're mainly most interested in the corners and edges. So you don't have to be very precise, but once I've roughly aligned many of the stars in the center of the image, then I'm going to go up to the top toolbar within the free transform tool, and I'm going to switch between the free transform to the warp mode, this little funny icon here. Now I'm going to start concentrating on the corners. And I'm going to use my pen or mouse, and I'm going to move. And then when I'm doing so, I'm warping the image ever so slightly so that I can align the stars. I'm then going to move to the next corner and do the same thing. And you can see as I line the stars, the differences, other than maybe some of the differences in aberration, are pretty much going to disappear. Now, once I've made the initial corner adjustments, because I'm in warp mode, I can start to concentrate on some of the other regions of the image and improve the alignment. Now, this right here may look like it's not aligned, but it is more than aligned for our purposes of correcting aberrations. Again, I'm just continuing around the photo, looking for areas that need a little bit of tweaking. And in the process, and I would say this portion of the image is in pretty good shape, in the process, I will further reduce those differences that show up in this mode. And I think that's actually looking pretty good. So I'm zoomed out to full view, press return, we'll accept the warp and the changes. Now I'll go back up and change the difference blend mode back to normal. If I toggle off these layers, you can see that other than the really bright stars that change their spherical aberration from one shot to the next, that there's really no changes. So this is a well-aligned photo, at least for purposes of correcting these aberrations. Next step is to apply a layer mask and then invert that layer mask so that it is black. Black conceals, white reveals. I'll then select my brush tool and I'll make sure that it is, initially I'm going to start out with a fairly small brush, small round brush, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom into 100%. And remember, we're focusing on, or we're concentrating on the edges and corners of the frame here. So once I've reached those areas, make sure that white is the brush color that I've selected so that I'm painting on and have selected the layer mask over here. I can adjust my size if I want to just focus or concentrate on individual stars and making the corrections. You can see that improved the aberration. So I can work around the photo in such fashion, just concentrating and making changes to the stars, brightest stars, those that exhibited the worst aberrations. For illustration's sake, I would continue working on that corner until I'm happy, but for illustration's sake and time, I'm just going to go ahead and move down to this corner, increase my brush size, and show you how you can perform these changes even quicker. So here I'm applying, brushing over the entire region of the corner where I know these aberrations appear. And if you had a lens that had a larger region or more of the edge that was aberrated, you can make a more sweeping change like this. So here we're zoomed back out to full extent. And the nice thing about this technique is that I'm masking in actual pixels of the same objects I captured with the camera, using the same exposure settings, so there's not going to be any light or dark anomalies created as part of the masking process that I'll have to worry about spending additional time to fix. If I did a sufficient job aligning the images, I also shouldn't have to worry about ghosting where the mask is applied. Other than spending a few minutes aligning the images, this is a quick method to correct aberrations, and in my opinion, a better technique than taking only one photo and using the clone stamp or other tools to replace pixels by brushing around individual stars that are exhibiting aberrations, which incidentally is a technique that I will demonstrate in part 2 of this series. So that's pretty much it. I can now merge down the layers into a baseline image and begin applying any creative post-processing adjustments that I feel is necessary. I hope you've learned something you can apply towards editing your own star photos. If you have any questions about what I covered, feel free to send me an email at imagesbybolin@charter.net, add a comment below this video, or you can visit my website at imagesbybolin.com and click on the contacts link. Thanks for watching.